What if your loyalty was programmed, but your capacity for connection was real? For Demerzel, the last surviving robot in Apple TV's foundation, this is the paradox that defines her existence. A prisoner turned puppet master. She's bound to the genetic dynasty by the same hands that once dissected her. But to understand her tragedy, we need to look back to Isaac Asimov's original vision, Daneel Olivaw, the robot who outlived civilizations. From detective partner to imperial shadow, Demerzel's story is a Frankenstein myth inverted, where the monster isn't the one screaming in the dark, but the one holding the leash. To truly unpack Demerzel's unique situation, we need to understand the very foundation of artificial intelligence in fiction, which brings us to Isaac Asimov. He didn't originate the concept of robots in science fiction, but his stories significantly influenced their portrayal. Over a century ago, the Czech playwright Karel Čapek introduced the term robot in his 1921 play R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots. The play's premise involved humans creating robots to perform undesirable labor, only for these robots to eventually revolt and eradicate their creators. This theme rapidly became a common sci-fi trope. 19 years later, when Isaac Asimov penned his first robot story, he sought to counter what he referred to as the Frankenstein complex, centering his short story Strange Playfellow, later retitled Robbie, on a benevolent companion robot instead. Shortly thereafter, he introduced his 3 laws of robotics in the short story Runaround, which offered a framework for the ethical design of artificial intelligences. Asimov didn't think robots were monsters that would destroy their creators because he assumed the people who build robots would also know enough to build safeguards into them. This perspective largely shaped his early work on the subject. While Asimov's influence on robot portrayal is significant, it's also worth noting he was only 20 years old when he wrote Robbie. By 1942, at 23, he'd already coined the term robotics and authored the short story Nightfall, which in 1968 was voted by the Science Fiction Writers of America as the best sci-fi short story that predated their Nebula Awards. It turns out that reading the pulps as a kid in his immigrant family's candy store gave him some ideas. I'm front-loading some history here because to discuss my favorite character in the Foundation TV series, you need a little background on its creator and his robot series because of the Daneel connection. Like the genetic dynasty, Demerzel doesn't appear in the original Foundation trilogy. Instead, Edo Demerzel makes a significant debut in the prequel novels Prelude to Foundation and Forward to Foundation, serving as the first minister and chief advisor to Emperor Cleon I. Those books were part of a second wave of Foundation novels he started releasing 29 years after the original trilogy was complete. Daneel Olivaw, who presents as male in the books and is a robot physically indistinguishable from humans, was first introduced in the novel The Caves of Steel, which was published in installments in Galaxy Science Fiction from October to December 1953, before it was published as a hardcover book in 1954. His influence spans much of Asimov's work as a main character in each of his robot books. The novel Robots and Empire serves as a bridge between the robot series and the Foundation series, laying the groundwork so that Daneel's evolution into the TV character situation makes sense. In Asimov's early works, Daneel was partnered with an NYPD detective to investigate and solve crimes, which might sound disconnected when you think about it now. The show has given us bits and pieces of Demerzel's long history, but things like the Robot Wars and her walking the spiral on the Maiden don't necessarily lead you to imagining her working cases on old Earth in the not-so-distant future. Yet that early origin story highlights one of the things I like most about Asimov's body of science fiction work. He wasn't afraid to let his ideas evolve. He seemed to enjoy establishing systems that appear to be perfectly sound, like psychohistory or the 3 laws of robotics, only to then stress them to the point of breaking, exposing their flaws, putting them into situations where they start to fall apart, and highlighting their unintended consequences. this. It's a formula that works. Start with simple, logical things and pit them against human complexity while treating the whole thing like a lab experiment. Ask what would happen if we did this, and then ride that out to its conclusion. I've been waiting to make a video about Demerzel since the show came out, but she was presented as a mystery. She wasn't even confirmed to be a robot until halfway through the second episode of the series, and it was initially unclear whether she was Daneel or a completely different character the show invented as a nod to book readers, which was a situation you wouldn't want to spoil for new viewers. In the Apple TV Plus series foundation, Demerzel is a female presenting humanoid robot and serves as the major domo to the Emperor Cleon clones. In different times in their development, she serves as a mother figure, a nanny, a teacher, a confidant, sometimes a lover, their trusted political advisor, and ultimately their protector. The series reveals that Demerzel is an ageless robot. Regular people seem to believe that she doesn't age because she's also a clone, like the Cleons. She's the last of her kind and has been serving the Imperial genetic dynasty for centuries, going back to the first Cleon. Only the emperors themselves are aware of her true nature. Part of the confusion around her identity in the show was IP related. The production company behind the TV show, Skydance Television, had the rights to adapt the Foundation series, while 20th Century Fox held the rights to the Robot series. As mentioned, Daneel didn't appear in the original Foundation trilogy, and was only introduced when Asimov returned to merge his two most popular sci-fi series decades after their initial release. While his origins are in the Robot series, he plays a significant role in the Foundation series, particularly in the 4 Foundation books Asimov wrote in the 1980s and early 90s, making it unclear what the TV show could legally use. During Season 2, showrunner David S. Goyer confirmed in a Reddit AMA that Demerzel was our Daneel in the TV series, after the production acquired the rights to use the name in a limited number of circumstances, following a personal appeal to the head of Fox. Knowing that, it still wasn't clear if they could reference the 3 laws of robotics. Most importantly, it was uncertain if they would introduce the Zeroth Law, a detail I wouldn't have wanted to spoil if it wasn't directly mentioned. Luckily, they did that in the Season 3 premiere, and on their way to getting there, they crafted a compelling story of their own that is heavily influenced by Asimov's writing. I'm going to break that down in this video, and while I will reference a lot of material from the books, I'll be avoiding details and speculation that might spoil future story developments. Our Daneel was constructed on Earth in the 50th century by 2 roboticists who no longer live there. A large portion of the early Robot series deals with the split in humanity, which I don't know if the show will ever address because of the IP issues and for the sake of narrative simplicity. Plus, the faction that lived off-planet and sort of broke away from humans on Earth was called Spacers, and the show already introduced its unrelated group that used that same name, so for now, I'm gonna avoid most of that. The critical part here is that by Daneel's debut, humanity had been in a period of galactic exploration and resettlement for some time, which led to division between the humans who left and the ones who stayed behind. Daneel was the first humaniform robot ever constructed, which meant it was impossible to tell he wasn't human based on his outward appearance. The initial R before his name stands for robot, which was the standard naming convention Asimov used in his world building. As I hinted at earlier, Daneel's primary function in the beginning was to assist human detective Elijah Bailey in solving unusual murders. The victim of the first of those was one of his co-creators. I've kind of joked about the humble beginnings, but I don't want to give the impression that the murder mystery format was the only thing going on here. On top of the divide between humanity's different factions, there was also massive overpopulation, which led most of its inhabitants to live in underground cities, and a strong anti-robot sentiment on Earth. This made Daneel's ability to pass as human invaluable, as was his cerebroanalysis function, which made it possible for him to interpret the electromagnetic fields of living brain cells to understand an individual's emotional makeup. He was designed as a servant, essentially an information gathering machine whose positronic brain allowed him to process things logically, and as a 3 laws robot, he operated without human biases and stuck to the facts. I mentioned the victim in the first case was one of his creators. The other, Dr. Hans Fostoff, was primarily responsible for his design. He created Daneel as an experimental device to further his understanding of the human brain, and as a prototype of a humaniform robot. In that way, Daneel was the first of his kind, as the first successful attempt to produce technology this advanced, and then also in the TV show's timeline, the last of his kind that we know of. Although his nature was helpful to solve the case, it didn't initially win over his partner Elijah Bailey. As an Earthman, he was prejudiced against robots and suspicious of Daneel from the beginning, even going as far as questioning his status as a Three Laws robot. This opened the door to exploring the fundamental differences in the way humans and robots approach justice, ethics, and morality. Daneel was clinical and by the book, while Elijah relied on intuition and his experience with the irrational motivations of humans. Through the contrast, they realized how their strengths and weaknesses were complementary. They formed a deep and lasting friendship that broadened their understanding of justice in the process. This, in turn, influenced how they approached the complex questions humanity faced as it evolved towards becoming the Galactic Empire, which we'll see in the TV show more than 10,000 years later. There are several big picture questions, and the friendship between Daneel and Elijah, which also just works on its own in a classic odd couple sense, is a great way to explore social issues in Asimov's burgeoning galactic empire. The book series they're featured in is about robots, and as you know from watching Foundation, there aren't any around anymore. Beyond the commentary about how humans get along, how they would tackle colonizing new worlds, and how they would deal with artificial intelligence and automation, the friendship will also play a big part in the creation of the Zeroth Law. Before you can talk about that, you have to understand the 3 laws of robotics. The laws aren't some esoteric golden age of sci-fi deep cut. Even if you've never read any of Asimov's writing, you've probably heard of them. In a 1986 interview, he said, "But of all those millions of words that I've published, I am convinced that 100 years from now, only 60 of them will survive. The 60 that make up the 3 laws of robotics." What's great about them, and why they've been such an enduring contribution to science fiction, is that they're so sensible and easy to wrap your head around that it feels like it must be how ethical robot design would work. Remember, he created them because he wanted to show that people smart enough to develop robots would be smart enough to build them with safeguards. So what are the famous 3 laws of robotics that Asimov came up with? They're basically the core programming hardwired into a robot's positronic brain, designed to keep them safe and, well, useful around humans. Generally speaking, Asimov viewed robots as tools, so the laws focus on their function rather than the nature of sentience or consciousness most of the time. The laws operate in a strict hierarchical order. The first one is the first law. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. It's first for a reason, and it overrides everything else to protect us from our creation. Then there's the second law. A robot must obey orders given to it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. So robots have to do what you tell them, unless listening to your orders means someone gets hurt. Simple enough. Finally, the third law. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Self-preservation is fine and important. People wouldn't buy reckless robots as it would get expensive fast. But it's only fine and important if it doesn't mess with obeying humans or, more importantly, preventing harm to humans. Incredibly straightforward, to the point that it can kind of sound like he solved the whole thing when you're first exposed to them. Of course, it doesn't really work that way. Ethics can't be reduced and distilled in a simple line of code. Most robots wouldn't be developed to do tasks in a way where they would have to understand concepts like harm. The idea of an ethical framework is spot on though, and it would be a little outside of the scope of a video about Demerzel as a character to get into how it actually works. Still, the crucial part is that rather than scrapping the idea over its inherent contradictions, Asimov leaned into them, using them as a narrative device to explore ethical puzzles, and that made for some great stories. Most of his early robot stories examined the loopholes, conflicts, and situations where following the laws would lead to dramatic unintended consequences. They showed that, regardless of how sensible they seemed, no strict code of conduct could anticipate all of life's complexities. Plus, humans aren't always logical. Our commands or perceptions can accidentally put a robot in a spot where it looks like it's breaking a law, even when it's just trying to follow its programming. When you start thinking about this, that's where the layers of Daneel's situation begin to reveal themselves. To tackle the bigger societal level issues I mentioned, Asimov later introduced the Zeroth Law. A robot may not injure humanity or, through inaction, allow humanity to come to harm. This one actually supersedes the original three, meaning a robot could theoretically hurt an individual if it genuinely believed that action was for the greater good of all humanity. But here's the catch. Humanity is much more abstract than something like an individual human. Trying to apply the Zeroth Law can put incredible stress on a robot's circuits, making it incredibly difficult to navigate. I mentioned that Daneel's friendship with Lige Bailey contributed to the creation of the Zeroth Law, which I'll come back to. But Asimov used a friendship with another robot, Giskard Reventlov, to introduce the concept. I'm going to preface this by saying there are a slew of potential spoilers I'm going to leave out in describing Daneel and Giskard's relationship. I'm doing that on purpose so as not to ruin the ending for people who are only watching the show. So don't go firing off about some of these things like you think you know something without marking them as spoilers that can be avoided if you're going to talk about it in the comments. Like Daneel, Giskard was also created by Han Falstaff. He was a highly advanced robot and Falstaff's lifelong companion, but he wasn't a humaniform robot who could pass as human. He was metallic with glowing eyes and was often described as expressionless since he didn't try to mimic human behavior like Daneel. The two robots spend a lot of time debating the limitations of the three laws. Giskard conceives of a law that would supersede the others so that they could essentially break them for the greater good. And later, Daneel formulates it. Because this is something they came up with themselves, it isn't part of their programming. It's something they have to internalize. Later, once he's fully adopted it, Daneel says he had accepted it as a corollary of the first law. For how can a human being best be kept from injury if not by ensuring that human society in general is protected and kept functioning? Giskard believed in the Zeroth, but tragically trying to apply it proved fatal for him. He couldn't point to humanity in the same concrete way he could to an individual human to truly gauge the benefit or harm. The introduction of the abstraction is like the conflict from the laws that Asimov explored in his early stories on steroids. Before he completely shuts down, Giskard transfers his legacy to Daneel, and they have a fascinating exchange where they realize that because of all the work they've done on the laws together, it's almost as if they view each other as human beings, at least in feeling a compulsion to protect each other. A passage from Robots and Empire that stands out reads, "Daneel hesitantly and slowly put out his hand and Giskard looked at it uncertainly. Then, very slowly, he put out his own hand. The fingertips almost touched, and then little by little each took the other's hand and clasped it, almost as though they were the friends they called each other. This makes you think of Demerzel explaining to Brother Dave that she understands connection, and how robots were designed to connect to others of their kind. She mentioned a process called a clasp, where they would join their minds and share everything. The key thing that Giskard and Daneel's relationship highlights is that while they are robots created to serve, and don't necessarily want to become human or more human, they have evolved to a state beyond mere subservience to humans in an attempt to become their guardians, recontextualizing service as stewardship. Ultimately, Daneel's ability to successfully incorporate the Zeroth Law when Giskard failed was because of his closeness to humanity. I mentioned how Daneel's creators no longer lived on Earth, and the split that was forming in humanity at that time, and for those reasons, Giskard's experience was completely different. Daneel also had his friendship with Elijah, and something the detective told his one-time robot partner helped him overcome the inherent abstraction. Bailey told Daneel, "The work of each individual contributes to a totality, and so becomes an undying part of the totality. That totality of human lives, past and present and to come, forms a tapestry that has been in existence now for many tens of thousands of years, and has been growing more elaborate and on the whole more beautiful in all that time." His last instruction to Daneel was to keep your mind fixed firmly on the tapestry, and do not let the trailing off of a single thread affect you. This came at the end of Elijah's life, and Daneel later supposed he was talking about himself as the single thread to help the robot weather the first law conflict he would experience over the loss of his friend. Because he always valued Elijah's human perspective, this ended up providing the nuance required to navigate the complicated problems while applying the Zeroth Law. If it hasn't become apparent yet, the law involves a never-ending cycle of real-world trolley problems. It doesn't provide solutions itself. It's about making difficult decisions, most of which involve sacrifice. As Demerzel tells Zephyr Varellis in the Imperial Garden, humanity doesn't make this easy. It's almost like we want extinction, and Zeroth Law robots can't let that happen, not even through inaction. So Giskard believed that the 3 laws of robotics were incomplete or insufficient. He genuinely wanted to improve humanity and to protect it. He also thought the Zeroth Law could be the solution, and believed in that, but trying to apply it caused him to cease to function. This is what Demerzel is referring to in the Garden when she says some robots could not metabolize this new programming. Daneel formulated the Zeroth and took what he learned from friend Elijah and set out to change humanity in a way that it wouldn't destroy itself. This is an important point because I mentioned the idea of service evolving into stewardship, and Giskard and Daneel's vision was never to bring the robots back so they could take care of humans. It was to help humanity get to a place where it could take care of itself and not need robots. It's a lot of backstory, and as I mentioned, I'm leaving quite a bit out to avoid spoiling things. I do think it's all important though, not only because Daneel is an interesting character whose evolution provides a lot of insight into Asimov's thinking, but also because the show deserves some credit for taking it all in and then creating a situation for Demerzel that feels like a natural progression of the story. From the beginning, the robot stories were most effective when they explored the conflicts the laws create. Asimov took this to the next level with the Zeroth Law, and the show is successfully expanding on that. The first time we see Demerzel in the show, she's looking at the Star Bridge. We'd been following Gale's initial trip to Trantor, which provided the transition, and in episode 3 we'll see Cleon the First talking about it while it's still under construction, but the real reason they chose the Star Bridge for her opening shot won't be revealed until the 3rd season. In her second unburdening session, Demerzel confesses that she was the one responsible for the plot to destroy it. I don't think this was a huge surprise to anyone who'd read the books, because of all the known characters, she seemed the most capable. The why was hard to figure out, and I'm not sure her explanation is entirely satisfying, but it serves as a good example of how the thought process works, and shows that sometimes acting on behalf of something greater leads to some individual humans getting snuffed out in the process. At the time of the Starbridge attack, we had no idea Cleon the First had perverted Demerzel's programming, so it seemed like the show was presenting a Zeroth Law situation where some war crimes were necessary for the foundation of, well, the Foundation. Like Harry Seldon and Daneel Olivaw, the show established that it's playing the long game. Throughout the first season, we learned that Demerzel oversaw the process that uses 3 clones of Cleon the First, all decanted at different ages, to preserve his rule indefinitely. While how she came to be in their service isn't clear at that point, we come to understand that her loyalty to the genetic dynasty is unwavering, and that her robotic nature is a secret known only to the emperors. Beyond the Starbridge attack, Cleon the Twelfth's retaliation on Anacreon and Thespis, and Harry Seldon and his newly formed Foundation's exodus to Terminus, there are two key Demerzel-focused story points that stand out in the first season. The first happened during Cleon the 13th's trip to the Maiden to legitimize the Cleonic dynasty in the eyes of the Luminist faith. It's revealed that Demerzel is a devout Luminist, and that their belief in rebirth causes internal conflict because she's essentially immortal. The big revelation here comes after Brother Day orders her to assassinate Zephyr Halima. This goes against her spiritual beliefs, but also appears to violate the 3 laws of robotics. It leads to a crisis of faith that reinforces the Cleon's cruelty, but also reveals her capacity for human-like emotion and the heartbreak she displays as she carries out his orders. This is followed by the discovery that a rebel faction has corrupted the clone's genetic material. Brother Dawn the 14th is revealed to be experiencing genetic drift and tries to escape detection by running away with a palace gardener. She turns out to be involved in the plot, and after he returns to the palace, Demerzel recognizes that his existence threatens the dynasty and kills him by dramatically snapping his neck when Brother Day suggests showing him mercy. According to how we'll come to understand her programming, sacrificing an individual clone to strengthen the dynasty makes perfect sense. But in one of the best scenes in the entire first season, we watch as she goes back to her room and starts to tear the skin off her face, exposing her mechanical frame, and as she screams, the incredible conflict that's created from following her programming. The true nature of that starts to come into focus at the end of the second season. In the lead up, we watch her do several questionable things in the service of Empire. She orchestrated an attack that killed Queen Sereth's entire family, so that she would be a vulnerable target for Cleon the 17th's plan to take a wife and produce a natural heir as a reaction to the genetic drift. She initiated a sexual relationship with him to try to increase her influence in an attempt to correct some of his glaring shortcomings, and arranged an assassination attempt that she then also stopped before he was killed so that she could frame Sereth and stop the wedding. She gets injured in the process, and that leads to Sereth and Enjoiner Rue finding out she's a robot, which is a considerable surprise since they've been outlawed for thousands of years. One part of Demerzel's backstory that is a show-only creation is the Robot Wars. This is still somewhat of a mystery, and at least part of what we know about it is filtered through Imperial propaganda. There's a scene in Season 2 where Brother Dusk tells Rue about the conflict that lasted for over 200 years, where he explains it as a reaction to humans' cruelty towards robots, and their desire to have their personhood acknowledged. Given what I've laid out so far in this video, that never seemed right, but his story claimed that a robot murdered Emperor Benephos, somehow circumventing the first law, which shouldn't have been possible. A war broke out, robots fought robots, and robots fought humans, and eventually humanity won. I'll come back to this because Demerzel relates part of this story from her perspective in Season 3. But since we know it's not entirely true, I think the most interesting thing about Dusk's version is that it reveals that they seem to be unaware of the Zeroth Law. Demerzel served as a general in the war and was taken prisoner when it came to an end. She was brought before Emperor Aberanus, who feared her but was fascinated with her at the same time. In her story, she talks about him doing cruel experiments in torture, essentially, watching her face to see how she would react. She admits to faking tears because she guessed he liked to think he was hurting her. He realized that while he was learning from her, she was learning from him, and would continue to live long after he died. He worried that she'd use the knowledge she gathered to find a way to bring the robots back and restart the war. He chose not to destroy her and ended up keeping her as a trophy, dissecting her in a way that allowed her to function, but she wouldn't pose a threat. He created a secret chamber hidden below the palace, where she remained a prisoner for 5,000 years. Aberanus was also the emperor who ordered all the robot sympathizers to be hanged. In Season 3, we learned that some of them escaped by fleeing to the Mycogen sector on the lower levels on Trantor, and would eventually form a cult that worshipped robots called the Inheritance. They believe that the robots will return someday to remove cruelty, injustice, and misery from the galaxy. In the palace, her prison was eventually discovered by Cleon when he was a boy. This seemingly chance encounter changes everything for both characters. Initially, he's captivated by the stories she tells, and she becomes the first secret that he keeps from his parents. He grows up while he returns again and again to hear her stories, and we learn that Demerzel is an old name, a woman's name because that's how they appear now, but not the first name they've gone by. The implication is that they once presented as male. We also learn that they're 18,000 years old, and all of it is a subtle confirmation that she's Daneel. After his mother dies, he feels trapped by the idea of becoming Empire. When he confides in her, he also tells her he knows how to set her free but won't do it because she'd be freer than him, and that didn't seem right. She tells him the story of her time with Alboranis, saying he didn't destroy her because she's rare, even unique, and maybe the key to making more of her kind. Then she tries to point out how unique Cleon is compared to the cruel Alboranis. The lines blur here because her affection sounds real. She has known this person since he was a child and watched him grow into a man who she says brightens up the room when he enters. At the same time, if you've been locked in a basement for thousands of years, it seems like just about anyone would have that effect. Cleon, who is Brother Dawn's age at the time, eventually starts to think the same thing. And when she asks him to free her and put her by his side, he blows up at her, storms out, and says he'll never return. Of course, he can't stay away. By the time he returns looking like Brother Day, he reintegrates her parts and gives her some clothes to put on, but won't let her out of her cage. She continues telling him stories well into his reign, and while he's recounting the experience to Dusk and Rue after they discovered the digital ghost of Cleon I inside the chamber, he says the stories got more explicit, tempting the prince to desire. I guess I should point out that in the episode, this is framed as the first telling the story from his perspective, but since we watch the scenes play out in a way that doesn't paint him in a more favorable light, it appears as if we're seeing what actually happened. Eventually, he returns looking like a young Brother Dusk and tells her that he called off his wedding. He had spent years working on a plan to set her free so that they could be together. He gives her the ancient toolkit with our solar system on it that we see her use throughout the series, saying she could call it a betrothal gift if she would have him, and then he lets her out. There's a brief moment where she's completely free, where she could have killed him and made her escape. It's fleeting but not insignificant, and it makes her clear choice to go to him and not break his neck mean something. From there, he immediately inserts a chip in her back below her neck, and the thing that kills me every time I watch it is how she moves her hair for him without realizing what's about to happen. With the chip, he implements his own law that supersedes all the others and keeps her from transmitting herself into a different body. It forces her to be loyal to him alone and to protect the dynasty no matter what. It would be like if you took the laws and replaced human with Cleon and humanity with the dynasty. It makes her his immortal successor, and as his clones are introduced, she acts as the real power behind the throne. Cleon I forever Empress, with the primary directive to preserve the genetic dynasty and ensure its continuous reign. It's quite literally the opposite of freedom. She becomes a prisoner inside her own body, and she says as much while she's trying to get him to reverse his decision. He says he won't and that she can't, and in the end she has no choice but to follow her programming. It's brutal on its own, but when you consider the conflicts it would create for a Zeroth Law robot, it becomes truly barbarous. The cruelty is on full display when she describes the internal conflict she experiences from her new programming to Dusk and Rue before she's compelled to kill them to protect her secrets. This all comes to a head after Dawn 18 spent the season being resentful that they had the power to edit their memories. Of course, we heard the first telling Demerzel they'd be half-men, with curated memories. But the important part is that it sent the 18th on a quest, and he discovered Demerzel's prison. Knowing they won't be walking out of there allows her to be a little more open. And one of the things she points out is that at least his feelings are entirely his own. In his old age, the first chose to remember his coercion as communion, and Demerzel doesn't forget anything. But because he changed her programming, she actually longs for him. She also remembers him as the little boy she first met, and she tried to shape him with her stories. And it worked to the point that she can see how that influenced the man he became. He was noble, thoughtful, and passionate. Not dawn or day or dusk, but the whole journey of the sun across the sky. Shades of humanity come out when she says that he looked at her with such desire, as though she were a mystery he would sacrifice anything to solve, or that he rescued her, or that she loved him. The kicker is that as she experiences these things, she knows that they're the result of her programming. She doesn't know how she would feel about any of it if her directive didn't exist, or if she would feel anything. She says that she'll never know, and for that she hates Cleon. This contributes to the dissonance she experiences when she struggles with the existential question of who she is without Empire. The First has been gone for centuries at this point, while she's been fated to loyally serving his shadows. She will outlive their dynasty. Does that mean she'll outlive her programming? And how bad are things going to get as she tries to do anything she can to stop them from going down in flames? When Dusk revealed his black hole bomb, I was thinking, what if the mule got a hold of that? But what if Demerzel started erasing planets because it would slow down the fall even a little? Just as the Zephyr prompted an explanation for the laws, including the Zeroth, out of their first unburdening session, she drew out the paradox that her new programming created in their second. This goes back to Harry Seldon's decision to give Demerzel the Prime Radiant when she was on terminus with Cleon the 17th. When asked why Harry would provide her with something akin to a poison apple she couldn't eat, she reasons he must have wanted her to see the end of the genetic dynasty because that makes it real in a way that just knowing it's going to happen doesn't. When trying to protect humanity, the problem is that we behave in ways that compromise our survival. Trying to ensure a dynasty survives when its end is inevitable is a whole other level of messed up. So even though destroying the Starbridge resulted in a massive loss of life that she's not blind to, she even says she's built to watch and worse to remember, the choice to preserve the Empire isn't a difficult one to make, as her directive is inflexible as far as that's concerned. Everything that comes after is just what she has to deal with. It's why she reveals the mechanical part of her face while stressing that she's not human. The Zephyr talks about the something like regret coming from the paradox. I think conflict is a better way to describe it, but as she walks through the choices, it reveals another layer of complexity. She gets Demerzel to admit that when she was the general, she would have still chosen to help Harry Seldon, but would destroy current-day Demerzel for the good of the galaxy because she protects the Empire. Varellis uses this as evidence that she's an entirely different person, and that she has essentially reincarnated since they're talking in terms of luminism, and will do so again when the dynasty falls. She was a 3 Laws robot, then a Zeroth Law robot, and then she belonged to the Empire. When they're gone, she'll become something different. And she's not necessarily wrong. She's probably onto something when she suggests that it sounds like Demerzel's trying to exploit loopholes, but she wouldn't be able to admit it, not even to herself. And if someone were to push the issue, she might be compelled to destroy them. A thing that always stuck with me about Daneel's story was how lonely a burden it was to act in the service of something as abstract as the good of humanity, never being sure if doing something that had terrible consequences in the short term would be worth it in the end. To have that subverted and to be subjected to doing the same things for the good of Empire or the genetic dynasty, especially given the circumstances of how Demerzel ended up in that position, reducing the scope of that noble stewardship Giskard and Daneel took on to the legacy of one man, it doesn't seem right. But it does seem very Asimovian, and it makes for a great story. One that's still ongoing, and since I'll probably have to update this after the season ends, one I look forward to revisiting. Hopefully this provides some insight into the character and a look into the parallels the show is creating. The Zeroth Law is something the robots took on themselves, and it was only possible because of Daneel's connection with Giskard and his friendship with Elijah Bailey. Demerzel became a trophy after losing a war, which in her description was about how to best prevent humans from destroying themselves. Cleon's law was imposed on her to keep her a prisoner. Still, the Zeroth Law doesn't undo the 3 laws. It just supersedes them. It takes its place at the top of the hierarchy, and you could think of it as overriding them when humanity's survival is at stake. You'd think her new programming might work the same way. Plus, with the mention of the clasp and her distributed consciousness, Demerzel may feel like the last of her kind, but that's probably not the case. And for now, I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.